being here. Let's get started.
Okay. I told them all it would be very informal and they didn't need to worry about
Yeah, I
anything.
don't think I need to read the big speech about don't yell out and
No, I think
do the
we're
jazz
okay.
hands.
That'll happen later at
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
hearings, I'm
That's
sure.
later, Right.
So Susan Anderson, Director of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, maybe I can have my team introduce themselves.
Joe Zender, Chief Planner, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
Mindy Brooks, Planning and Sustainability.
Sally Edmonds, Planning and Sustainability.
Rachel Hoy, Planning and Sustainability.
Brandon Spencer Hardall, Planning and Sustainability.
Nicholas Starren, Planning and Sustainability.
So you can see we have most of the office here. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of context and then turn the discussion over to Sally and her team. So just for context, the Central City is currently home to 39,000 people who live here, and in single-family and multifamily dwellings. In addition, there's 120,000 people who come to work here every day, and all of this is on just 3% of the land mass of the city. Over the next 20 years, we expect the Central City to grow significantly, 50,000 more jobs and 38,000 more households, so housing units needed. This plan that we have now makes sure that there's room and space for both, and to make sure that we continue to have a welcoming, prosperous, equitable city downtown through all of the different code changes and zoning changes and policies in the plan. I want to remind you, in your binder here, then, we have just a couple of slides. Remind you a little bit about where we've been. So 1972, this is old news for you, but in case there's people watching at home, Portland adopted in 1972 its downtown plan, first one. It sort of sparked the resurgence and really the reawakening of downtown as the economic and cultural region, center of the region. The plan spurred significant public and private investment. It was the time that we defined the transit mall as sort of the spine of the Central City, defined all the retail and office core areas, recognized the importance of protecting our historic buildings and places, and gave us Tom McCall Waterfront Park, among other things. In 1988, Portland built on this strong base with a new plan that broadened the notion of the Central City to include the Lloyd District and the Central East Side. It again focused on economic development and called for more housing development downtown. And so you both were here in those days, and people just didn't think about living downtown, and that has changed significantly. So here we are, 30 years later since the last Central City Plan, and we are at a turning point. Council instructed us a few years ago to develop a new plan that was focused on equity, that was focused on resilience, on jobs, and on health for everyone. So that's what we've done. Next slide. So the new plan takes us to 2035. It was built on the 3 quadrant plans. The 2 of you were here for all of that work, and we brought those to you. We also had a concept plan, which sort of laid out the fundamentals and the big ideas. More than 8,000 residents and business representatives were involved in the development of the Central City Plan. It includes, besides the quadrant plans, a scenic resource inventory, an inventory of natural resources, and a study to look at the ways we can prioritize and provide incentives for affordable housing. So Sally's going to walk through the plan with her team. I wanted to highlight just a couple of big ideas that are in the plan. One, and these are things that you'll hear a lot about during the testimony, I think, is the Innovation District. So opportunities for partnerships between OHSU, PSU, and other research institutes and the private sector, especially with our local workforce on the Central East Side and industries on the Central East Side. A second big move is truly thinking about the Central City as a neighborhood, not just a place where a few people live in our city, but it will soon be the region's largest neighborhood, so it'll be really the state's largest neighborhood, full of great housing and parks and shops and other amenities. And over the next 20 years, we expect 30% of the people who decide to move to Portland to choose the Central City as their home. So this will also include a significant amount of affordable housing focused on the bonuses and other incentives that have been put together over the past few years. All these people are going to continue to value and demand a green city, trees and parks, access to nature. The plan prioritizes access to the Willamette and protecting wildlife and water quality. It also focuses on improving the resilience of the central city and how we prepare for seismic events, floods, fires, and climate change. And also looks at preserving historic buildings, so you'll hear about that as we move through the plan, and also our scenic views for future generations. And then finally, actually, I'll have a quiz for the two of you. How much of the central city do you think is in streets and rights of way? This is the class participation part of the program.
35%?
I'm going to take over like 45%.
Well, I don't know if you get, if there's a buzzer for going over or not, but it's 40, you're right in the middle
40,
there.
oh, wow.
So, well done. So nearly 40% of the central city is devoted to streets and rights of way, and we wanted to make sure that all of that space is working for us. Because of our small blocks, it means we do have more rights of way than a lot of other cities, and in response, the plan calls for significant improvements to the public realm, to sidewalks and parks and open spaces so that we can bring people together in the central city. The Green Loop is a great example of that. It's proposed, as you know, a 6-mile linear park that would go from the downtown core so that people can walk and bike and stroll and roll around the downtown, through the Pearl, over the bridge, the Lloyd District, down through the Central East Side, back over the Tillicum Bridge to PSU area, and back to the core. So those are some of the highlights in the plan. I'm really thrilled to be moving this on to you for your consideration. The Planning and Sustainability Commission held a hearing that went on for 2 different meetings, and they had 9 work sessions, so a lot of work. Catherine Schultz and Andre will come to the hearing, or maybe both hearings, and be able to give a little bit more information from their perspective, and they will send you a letter as part of the document to let you know what things they worried about and things that they debated on. I think that's it for an introduction. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. Good morning. Sally Edmonds here. So I'm going to go over the Central City 2035 package, the ordinances and resolutions that you're going to be considering at the hearings, and the run-of-show for today. So first, the plan components. It's a big package. A good part of it is right here in front of me. We have and in your binder, there's a list of these. So we have Volume 1 that includes the goals and policies and some of the big ideas. That's some of what Susan just talked about. We have Volume 2, which is in 4 different parts. The first 3 are zoning code and map amendments. This is for the Central City Plan District, and this is what Rachel's going to be talking about in a few minutes. We have Volume 2A2, and this is the Willamette River and Trails, and Mindy Brooks is going to be talking about this in a few minutes. These are some of the regulations. Volume 2A3 is something that we'll touch on in just a couple of minutes briefly. And then there's a Volume 3 package, and these are inventories and protection plans. So we have the Scenic Resource Protection Plan. There's a summary and there's inventories of the scenic resources in the city, and Mindy will talk a little bit more about that shortly. We also have a Willamette River Natural Resource Inventory and Protection Plan, and this is the basis for the river and environmental related items in the plan. Then we have Volume 4, which is just a summary of a lot of background material you'll get on a jump drive in case you want to look back at something. We have Volume 5 is in 2 parts, and basically this is the implementation work plan for the city. There's performance targets and a lot of things that various city bureaus would, and others in the community would do in order to implement this plan. We have a separate one that's just focused on the Green Loop. One of the big ideas that I believe Susan mentioned, that's a really important part of the plan. And then finally, the final piece in the Central City 2035 package is the public involvement, and this outlines the various activities and that we did leading up to development of the proposed draft. The final piece that you'll hear about that's not really part of the Central City Plan, but is traveling with the Central City, is the new Chinatown, Japantown Historic Design Guidelines. And so Brandon will talk to you more about that shortly. So the mayor is going to be proposing some amendments to this plan that he will release next week. So you'll be able to get those in advance. They're not major, but there's some important ones. And before I move on, I just want to acknowledge the team and everyone at the table who did all this work. There's also Troy Doss, Debbie Bischoff, Mark Raggett, who are key members of the team, and lots of members of the audience that are from various bureaus that have been super helpful to us. So moving on to the next slide is, this is in the next page in your binder. This is the list of the ordinances and resolutions that you will be considering. So on September 7th, you will hear testimony on the bulk of this document. Most of the zoning code amendments, the scenic resource, natural resource, all those pieces. And then at the same time, you'll hear testimony on the actions and the like. Then later on September 7th, you'll hear testimony on early implementation of the U.S. Postal Service site. It's something that Prosper Portland has asked us to do due to the schedule for that project. They need a decision a little bit earlier. And so this is one of the mayor's amendments that I mentioned. Then on September 14th, you will hear testimony on the new Chinatown, Japantown Historic Design Guidelines that I also mentioned, and also the Environmental and Scenic Resource Code outside of the Central City, which is basically mapping scenic views within environmental zones. It's kind of a minor piece, but it's different from the rest of this package. So moving on. So here's the schedule. So as I mentioned, we have September 7th and 14th. We have hearings. We are planning to have discussions with you on various amendments through the fall. We anticipate a vote in January, and that vote would follow the acknowledgement of the comprehensive plan. So if that slips, then the vote may need to slip a bit. But assuming we stay on schedule, we are hoping for an effective date of March 1st, 2018 for the package. So, next is the run of show for today. And as you can see, there's 4 main topics here that we want to cover. And so we'll go through these. We'll highlight some of the things we think you might be hearing about in the testimony. And we have a lot of material to get through today. So we've planned, as you can see, 4 solid discussion breaks. So if you need to clarifying questions and the like, feel free to ask, but we have some presentations planned here. So I will turn it over to Rachel Hoy to kick things off.
Thank you, Sally. Rachel Hoy with BPS. And so the next slide that you have here, it's the first item that I'm going to talk about, the FAR changes. And one thing I want to make you aware of, at the back of this section, before you get to the blue tab in your binder, you have bigger maps. So for some of what I'm going to talk about, this first item for FAR changes, you have an 11 by 17 that may be easier to look at, as well as I may get up and point to some things at the map to give you a point of reference.
Could you start by telling people at home what FAR stands for?
Sure. So the FAR is floor area ratio. So what I'm going to talk about today are just related to floor area ratio, some of the changes we're proposing in the Central City. And what that is when we say floor area ratio, we're talking about basically the square footage that you can build on your site. How big can a building be? So we have ratios in the Central City that are based on site area, and they vary across the Central City. And I would say that the Central City have the highest floor area ratios, highest density than anywhere else in the city or the region for that matter. So it is a place where we expect and we want more housing and employment between now and 2035, and that's what our plan is calling for. So a couple of the things that I want to point out, and I'll speak loudly, but I'm going to walk over to the map to give you a point of reference. So some of the changes that we're proposing.
I'm sorry, I don't think you're going to be able to be captioned without speaking into the microphone.
So I'll hold this. Okay, thank you. Okay,
You
is
need
this
a
better?
few more hands, don't you?
Okay,
That's fine, thank
so
you.
just a couple things to point out on the map where we are proposing some changes. We are proposing FAR increases along the Transit Mall. So this is to the southern part of the central city. We're also proposing some changes to this area in South Downtown along the Lincoln Station area. So these two areas, Transit Mall and the station area, those are two areas where we've invested a lot of money in infrastructure and where we would expect to see higher density development in the future. A couple of other areas in the lighter blue. This area here is River Place to the south, and then up in the North Pearl. We're proposing slight increases from 4-to-1 to 5-to-1, and here with the inclusionary housing program, it created an opportunity for us to look at some other areas across the central city where we may want to consider increasing FARs. The reason for the slight increase here, it makes these areas eligible for a better inclusionary housing package, and we may see redevelopment sooner, and it could provide more affordable housing more quickly into the future.
Are these changes things that we've already discussed in the West Quadrant plan, or? So we made some tentative decisions in the West Quadrant plan, and this is coming back. Are there changes since then?
So most of these changes, that's correct. The two that I just mentioned are more reliant on the recent changes with inclusionary housing that went into effect this year.
Thank you.
So a couple of others, the post office site at 7-to-1 is the proposal, and that through the West Quadrant plan as well as the Broadway Corridor plan is a higher increase in density that was proposed. This is one of our key redevelopment sites, and we certainly expect high density mixed use development with affordable housing at that site. One other area that I'll just point out, it's kind of this larger stippled area within the central east side, and this is all industrial zoning. It's IG1, but the main point here is that we've actually assigned an FAR of 3-to-1. Typically, we don't have floor area ratios in our industrial zones, but we've assigned a floor area ratio of 3-to-1 to allow for industrial office. So that will certainly increase our employment densities within that area into the future. Okay. I'm going to hop back and forth here. So the next.
So when you say industrial office, what does that mean?
So industrial office is a use, and it's a use that we have started to see within the Central East Side where it's compatible with traditional industrial uses, but it can be like our creative office, high-tech software companies. So it's an allowance that we're making for more of that to happen in the Central East Side. And I will talk shortly about, but we want to maintain that balance to make sure that we still have our traditional industrial uses within the district as well.
Okay, thanks.
So the next slide that you have is on zoning. So I'll talk just briefly about zoning. Maybe, Nicholas, could you do me a favor? Could you point at things so as I talk, that may be quicker. So in the central city, most of the zoning that we have is central commercial. And in your colored map, you'll see that that's most of the red area is our central commercial, which allows a lot of flexibility for residential and commercial mixed-use development. The proposed changes that we're making to the zoning is in an effort to simplify the zoning pattern and add more flexibility across the central city. So some of the changes that we're proposing on the west side and also in the Lloyd District. We do have some RX zoning that we're proposing to change to CX zoning or central commercial. And again, the reason for this is to add more flexibility. We've seen a lot more residential development happening in our CX zone than we have in our RX zoning over the last 10 years. In addition, we're proposing to add some employment zoning, so our EX zoning along the east side of the river, a little bit in Albina, and then down along the southern edges of the central east side, Powell, and the newest part of the plan district that we're adding in the corner triangle there in the central east side. So one thing that I would like to point out here is that we do expect that we may receive some testimony on some of these zone changes, specifically in the areas we're proposing to change from RX to CX. So the next slide relates to something that Susan had made mention of, but one of our efforts with updating some of our standards in the plan district is related to how much area we actually have in streets. 40% of our land area is in streets, and so we'd like to make an effort to improve the pedestrian experience within the central city. We want to be more intentional about what we want some of our ground level experiences to be. So some of the changes that we're proposing, and this is back in your packet, I'm flipping back to one of the slides on page 11. And then the last map that we'll look at, I'll point you back to that one in just a moment. So page 11 of your slides. Some of the changes we're making to update some of our standards that will get at improving our pedestrian realm into the future, we're proposing to increase ground floor window coverage in the downtown area. We're also proposing to map more of our commercial corridors so that those areas we can ensure that our ground floors, the uses are more active along the ground floor. We're also proposing then on other streets in the central city that we allow for building setbacks and allow for more landscaping. In addition, we're also proposing to expand the prohibition of drive-throughs throughout the entire central city. Now, that does exist in a few places downtown, but not the whole central city right now. So that's our proposal moving forward to encourage, again, a high-density pedestrian and transit-oriented developments into the future.
Is that what we agreed on for the comprehensive plan language?
Correct.
So it's something.
Yes, it's
Any
consistent.
changes to what was done last year?
This is not a change to what was done. These are ideas. This certainly carries forward the ideas put forth during the quadrant plans.
Thank you.
And I will say here, I just wanted to share these points with you. We really have not received, we didn't receive a lot of testimony other than positive on these particular items.
So when will be the appropriate time for me to ask for reconsideration of the Morrison Bridgehead height?
And I'm going to get to height in just a moment here. So I'm going to go over a couple more quick, just want to talk a little bit about how we're proposing to, on the next page, page 12, how we've modified our bonus system, our floor area ratio or FAR bonus and transfer systems. Some of this won't be new to the council because of the inclusionary housing that took place. I think that everyone was aware that that would mean that we would also be updating the bonus system in the central city. So we're focusing on affordable housing. And so we have pretty dramatically modified the bonus system for the central city. We've gone from proposing to go from 19 bonuses to 6. And so they will be focused on 2 affordable housing bonuses. You either build on site or you pay into an affordable housing fund. And then we have a few specialized bonuses that are available. If you're a property along the riverfront, you can get increased FAR if you set further back from the river. And so that would be back from the river setback, further back from the setback that Mindy will talk about shortly. Another bonus is only available to the industrial zoning area that I mentioned in the Central East Side, this industrial space bonus. If you build a traditional industrial business on the ground floor of your building, you're eligible for more floor area for industrial office above that. So that's part of our effort of making sure that striking that balance to have traditional industrial businesses as well as making room for these new industrial office businesses. And then 3 bonuses we're proposing to keep that exist today only apply to South Waterfront. And those bonuses are based on open space and greenway development.
So are these the 6
That's it.
bonuses then? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
So, and as you see, really, it's the affordable housing bonuses that are available to all, and the others are specialized bonuses. So the transfer system, we've also are proposing to dramatically change. There'll be 2 transfers we're proposing to have available. We propose to update the historic resource transfer, and that transfer, a historic resource, before it can transfer its FAR, must be seismically upgraded and/or sign an agreement with the city that they will seismically upgrade their building into the future. So one of our reasons for doing that is to help meet another city goal of preserving our historic resources. It's one thing to allow them to transfer off their FAR, but preserving the building as well by seismically upgrading it is as important. In addition, to help offset some of the cost of that seismic upgrade, we're proposing to allow these historic landmarks to have an additional 3-to-1 FAR to sell. So that additional money that they would, from the purchase of their FAR, would be available to them to hopefully help offset some of the cost of the seismic upgrades. The other thing we're doing is we're expanding the area in which a transfer could occur for this. This would be open to any property in the central city. So that's a change. The other transfer is called transfer within a subdistrict, and that transfer is really only available after you've either already used the affordable housing bonus or the historic resource transfer. So you have to buy at least 3-to-1 in affordable housing or into the fund, or transfer from a historic property before you could access this transfer within a subdistrict. Okay. So next slide, I just want to quickly mention that we're expanding upon a new tool in the Central City, creating a new urban design tool called the Central City Master Plan. This is important because we've identified some big sites that are key redevelopment sites within the Central City. And we feel that we'll get the best result for these sites if they can be planned and designed as a whole site, ensuring that there's strong connections within the site and integrating these sites well with the surrounding neighborhoods. So the map that you have on page 14 of your slides is of the 5 sites that it would be these sites would be required to go through a master plan. So OMSI, Clinton Station, Blanchard, the post office site, and Lincoln High School. Just at one point I would make, Lincoln High School would not have to go through the master plan if it is just the redevelopment of their school. But if there's something else there, then they would be required. This is also, can be a voluntary process that a property could enter into, but they have to be at least 160,000 square feet in size. So we feel this plan and this tool, it's expanded of what exists today. It's very important, we feel, for these redevelopment sites, and it'll take a strong look at the pedestrian realm, open space, infrastructure capacity, and future buildings within these properties. So the next slide is on Central City height considerations. So I wanted to walk through just some of the things that we consider and that we have worked on for the past 7 to 8 years during this planning process, and consider things that we consider when we're applying height. And then you have that map. It's important to note that all the heights that are proposed within the Central City, they provide an envelope to work within. It may not be what's there today, but the proposed heights allow flexibility. And at the same time, we're trying to pay attention to key areas where reduced heights are important to meet other city and goals and policies. So we have proposed some heights, increased heights at some difficult to develop sites. These are also important sites. So the bridgehead sites, for example, they are very difficult to develop, as well as their gateways or entryways into the downtown area. So we consider them important sites to the central city. A few other areas that I would point out that are difficult to develop but we are adding some increased height are along the riverfront in the North Pearl area. This is consistent with the North Pearl plan that called for increased heights in that area. And those tend to be more difficult to develop due to the greenway setback in those areas. We've also proposed more height along areas where major investments have been made, as I mentioned before, specifically the transit mall and station areas. In other cases, like the Lloyd District, we've proposed to add more height where we have very high FARs. So we were just trying to right-size our height in FARs to allow for full utilization of the FAR. And also, I just want to make kind of a footnote here that across the central city, we've maintained, with this proposal, we've maintained base heights. And all the height that we're proposing to add is bonus height. So the point there is that we want a public benefit to be provided in exchange for this increased height. So affordable housing, or that there's been some transfer from a historic resource. So the next slide, just continuing with some of our height considerations. Here's a short list of some considerations in lowering heights. In historic districts, we've proposed some reductions to maintain the historic character of these places, and Brandon's going to talk about that shortly. We've also proposed to reduce heights to protect public views. Mindy's going to talk a little bit more about that as well. We've also sculpted downtown with more height, as we mentioned, along the downtown commercial core, along the transit mall. But what we do is as we approach the edges, as you leave that and we move closer to our adjacent neighborhoods, we've transitioned to lower heights. And then the last slide here, again, just continuing with this, some of our height considerations. These last two can result in both some increases and decreases in height. So for example, we have proposed regulations that reduce shadows on our parks and open spaces. So this can, and there's a picture here on slide 17 that shows one of our shadow analyses that we did in-house. This can result in the sculpting of a building where there's less height adjacent to a park, but there may be more height setback as the building's set back against an adjacent street. We've also proposed special regulations, and these actually are not new, so we're not proposing to change them, but we have existing regulations for the North Pearl and South Waterfront where we sculpt buildings, taller buildings, to allow for light and air. So that's something we're proposing to continue with. So the map that Nicholas is looking at here, now that I've walked you through some of the considerations, just a quick set of reminders. So the areas in tan are areas where if you want bonus height, if you want more height than your base height, we are proposing increases. So those are the bridgeheads, the transit mall, South Pearl, Lloyd District are kind of some of the general areas where we're proposing increased height. Decreases in height are in blue, and those areas on the map here are primarily view corridors and our historic districts. We also have some areas in green, and those are just areas we're actually applying a height limit for the first time. In some cases, we're rezoning the area, or in other cases, it's protecting a public view. And in gray, there's a lot of area in gray here, we're not proposing any changes to height from what exists today. Okay. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to talk more specifically about two areas that I think we're going to receive testimony on related to our historic districts and public views.
Mindy Brooks. Good morning. I'm going to talk about scenic resources. We're on page 19 in your binder. So public views of Mount Hood, Portlandia, the Willamette River bridges are really an important part of what makes Portland, Portland, and is an important part of our tourism. And the city has been protecting these public views since 1979. Every update to the Central City Plan, Downtown Plan has included updates to protect these views, and we are continuing that work with Central City 2035. I want to stress that we protect public views, so we protect views that you can see from a street or a trail or a park. We don't protect private views from your office or a condo or an apartment complex. There are a couple of big moves, and I'm going to walk through the specifics of those, but the really big moves that we're moving, as Rachel talked about, we are adjusting some maximum building height allowances to continue to protect public views, and we are also proposing to allow tree removal within view corridors as long as the trees are replaced. So the next page, I'm going to walk through.
Excuse me, just on that last point. What about pruning the trees rather than removing them? Is there,
Yes, you can prune or remove the trees.
and does the city forester have authority under the proposal to decide whether they're pruned or removed?
No, it's a standard that would be within the environmental overlay zones that allow for the removal or pruning of trees, and then the property owner would decide what is the appropriate mechanism for preserving the view.
For street trees, the city forester would still have?
Yes,
authority?
outside of the view corridor, so along city streets or any other tree removal would be under Title 11.
No, I'm talking about tree removal under the scenic view corridor.
So I'll just clarify, these views cross lots of properties, and the only proposal that we're adding is when they're within an environmental overlay zone as well. So where the two things overlap with each other, and that is a very limited amount of properties. If it's outside of that, the view corridor doesn't cross an environmental overlay zone, then it's Title 11 that has the jurisdiction for those.
I'll read it over and might have some more questions. Thank you.
Okay. So there were a number of views that were, had a lot of discussion at Planning and Sustainability Commission, and so I want to highlight those for you, and we expect to hear testimony about them. The first one is the view of Mount Hood from Salmon Springs. So today there are lots of places along Waterfront Park and the Willamette River bridges where you can see Mount Hood, and without limiting heights in the Central East Side, those views will go away with development. Staff proposed to protect two of those views. One is Salmon Springs, and that's the picture that you have on the slide in front of you. And then the other is from Tillicum Crossing, which I'll talk about in a minute. In order to protect these views from Salmon Springs, the heights along the MLK Grand Corridor would need to be reduced from today's height limits of 100 to 200 feet down to 30 to 45 feet. So it's a very significant decrease, and it has some pretty big impacts on development capacity, especially along MLK Grand, which is a streetcar line there. So Planning and Sustainability Commission, they had a lot of discussion about this. They heard a lot of testimony about it, and ultimately they decided not to recommend protecting this view of Mount Hood from Salmon Springs. It was their closest vote. It was a hard one for them to do, and it will be in your letter. There'll be a bit more of discussion about that. On the next page, they did recommend holding onto the view of Mount Hood from Tillicum Crossing. So this does require heights to be limited as well to 60 to 90 feet. The heights in this portion of the city, or this portion of the district, the block pattern here is much larger than the rest of the city, and there are opportunities to move FAR and height around on the sites, so it doesn't have so much impact on development capacity in there. And like I said, we do anticipate testimony about both of these views.
What about some places you can see a view of Mount St. Helens? Are there scenic corridors on that?
Down by the river or just overall?
Just in general, there's a few places that you can.
Yeah, there are a few places. The best ones that we protect are from Washington Park, from the Rose Garden. And actually, Nicholas, up in North Pearl, there's two blue diagonals that cross. That one and that one, those are both views of Mount St. Helens.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the next view I want to talk about is the view of Vista Bridge from Jefferson Street. So the top view, the top picture, that you have there in front of you is the view from Southwest 14th. And this is the view that is currently protected. Heights are limited to 30 to 45 feet along Jefferson Street to protect that view of Vista Bridge. Jefferson Street is also a commercial corridor, and it's located at a light rail stop. And in order to protect, in order to support redevelopment, Planning and Sustainability Commission recommended allowing 75 feet tall buildings along Jefferson Street and designating a new viewpoint, which is the bottom location at Collins Circle, which is located at about Southwest 18th. By allowing 75 feet, it does have an impact on the top view. So there, you can see there's a yellow building envelope, a box that intrudes a bit into the view. That's what 75 feet would allow for in that top view. 75 feet doesn't have an impact on the view from Collins Circle, which is the bottom picture, again, with the building envelopes in there. I do want to point out that this is the only area in Goose Hollow where we're recommending a height increase. And we'll also hear testimony about this one. And then the last view that I want to talk about is the view of Mount Hood from Japanese Garden. So as I just mentioned, there are quite a few views from Washington Park that cross the central city. So we looked at those even though Washington Park is outside of the central city. We wanted to look at the building heights within the central city in relationship to these views. And the Japanese Garden view is actually the highest elevation, and what we found out is that the allowed building heights don't have an impact on that view, but vegetation does. And so you can see in the picture, the bottom picture is the view from 1971, and the top picture is a view from just a few years ago, and trees have grown up and are intruding into the view. So the recommendation there is within that yellow box that you can see on the top photo, tree removal would be allowed, as well as pruning vegetation within those areas, as long as the trees are replaced outside of that view corridor. You're probably going to hear some testimony about this. We've been working with the Japanese Garden very closely on this particular viewpoint.
So is the property owner required to take the tree out? Or-
No, there's no requirement for tree removal. So in this case, much of the property is parks, and so parks would decide what they wanted to do. It actually goes down then onto the Water Bureau property in front of the reservoirs, and so there would need to be a discussion between Parks and the Water Bureau about, what's appropriate for that area. And I'm going to turn it over now to Brandon to talk about historic districts and height.
Good morning, Commissioners. Brandon Spencer Hartle, BPS. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about height reductions in 2 historic districts. But I want to start it off with sort of a general overview of where our historic districts are in the central city and our policy approach. And I think this is timely. The council did recently have an appeal of a Landmarks Commission decision related to height and FAR in one historic district that I think sets the stage quite well for our discussion today. So on the map on page 24, you see our 7 historic districts that are located in the central city. They range in size from the 8 blocks of the Irvington Historic District that's located in the central city to the Halpern Open Space Sequence, which is on City of Portland property, to more larger districts in the Pearl and Old Town Chinatown. Go to the next slide. So as we reviewed our policy approach for protection of historic districts in the central city, there are a few considerations right out the bat that I think we'd like you to sort of have as a frame of reference. Several of our central city historic districts were listed in the National Register of Historic Places after our last review of height and FAR in the central city. Primarily, the 2 that were listed in the register after the 1988 Central City Plan are the East Portland Grand Avenue Historic District and the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District. And why that's significant is that we haven't yet had the opportunity through a larger planning process to evaluate what the appropriate height in those districts are for the protection of historic buildings and for the purpose of compatible infill in those districts. So for our general philosophical policy approach to these historic districts in the central city, as a starting point, we are recommending elimination of bonus height options in all central city historic districts. Where that really plays out is in the Irvington Historic District, those 8 blocks in the central city, the Northwest 13th Avenue Historic District in the Pearl, the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District, and the East Portland Grand Avenue Historic District. So that would be an elimination in those districts of 75 feet of bonus height option. The more significant change is, and I'll talk in more detail in a second about this, is a proposed refinement in height in the East Portland Grand Avenue Historic District and the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District, where we're recommending lowering the heights in some portions of those districts, in addition to the elimination of base height. One last thing I'd like to say about our general policy approach is we are not recommending reduction in FAR in the historic districts, and that's for two reasons. One, in our proposed height reductions on sites that are eligible for redevelopment, our modeling shows that it is achievable to, within the height envelope, utilize all of your existing base FAR. And secondarily, with the transfer program that Rachel mentioned earlier, for owners of historic resources, we don't want to preclude that option of transferring out floor area ratio when it could be an incentive for building rehabilitation. So getting into a more granular level, this is the East Portland Grand Avenue Historic District. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in the early 1990s. Today, heights in the district range from 100 to 200 feet with an additional 75-foot bonus option available. The average building height in this district is somewhere around 43 feet. However, there is one tall landmark building in the district, the Waverly Building, which is 160 feet. So in our discussions with the Historic Landmarks Commission, testimony that we received, and the Planning and Sustainability Commission, we're recommending eliminating that bonus height option and reducing the allowed height around that Waverly Building from 200 feet to 160 feet so that infill doesn't overshadow that building as the district develops out. I will say we expect testimony on both sides of this discussion to come on September 7th. In the second district, and the one where we're making the biggest move, or we're recommending the biggest move, is the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District. As you see in the maps on page 27, in the north end of the district between Everett and Gleason, 3rd and 5th, the current height limit is 350 feet with the option of a 75-foot bonus, bringing the development potential to 425 feet. And in the Landmarks Commission's Historic Resource Review process for the compatibility of infill, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, the notion of achieving a 425-foot building in this historic district is unfathomable to that commission. So in our study of that district and our study of what would be an appropriate height to allow for the utilization of the base FAR, but also maintain relative compatibility with the historic structures in the district, we're recommending a reduction in height in the north end of the Chinatown district to 125 feet. You'll also see on the height map that we are recommending, and it's the only place in a Central City Historic District that we're recommending this, an increase in height to 125 feet on the full block surface parking lot known as Block 33 between Northwest 4th and 5th Avenues, Davis and Cooch. And that recommendation comes out of the West Quadrant Plan, where that block specifically was identified as a development catalyst and an opportunity for denser development in the center of the historic district. Which leads me into the discussion of the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District Design Guidelines. One of the reasons we're bringing these guidelines forward with the Central City Plan is in the West Quadrant Plan discussions, the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District was identified as an opportunity to better manage growth and change in that district so that the new infill related to the authentic expressions of Chinese and Japanese history in the neighborhood. So in partnership with Prosper Portland over the last year and a half, BPS has developed district-specific design guidelines for New Chinatown Japantown that would allow for redevelopment, especially on Block 33, the surface parking lot, to be accomplished in a way that was sensitive and appropriate for the historic district. So the recommended Historic District Design Guidelines will come forward on September 14th. They will replace the more general River District Design Guidelines in this 10-block historic district. The guidelines address alterations, additions, and new construction projects. These guidelines were developed with a review of best practices for our recently adopted sets of historic district and general design guidelines. Throughout the development process of the guidelines, we engaged with the Historic Landmarks Commission, Prosper Portland, a 10-member stakeholder advisory committee, and held numerous open houses and public outreach events to get a temperature from the community about what the look and feel of infill in New Chinatown, Japantown would best look like. I think it's important to note that design guidelines do not set a maximum height or floor area ratio. What they are is their approval criteria to be used by the Historic Landmarks Commission and staff in the Bureau of Development Services around issues of architectural style, materials, things like signs, awnings, canopies. And so the recommended design guidelines that will be in front of you next month don't specify maximum building heights, but what they do is describe and guide how new infill and changes to historic buildings can best relate to the characteristics of the historic district. And one thing that I think is especially germane for this district is New Chinatown, Japantown is our only historic district in the city of Portland significant for ethnic history. And it's one of a very small handful of designated historic resources, individual landmarks and districts statewide significant for ethnic and cultural history. And so in the development of the design guidelines, special attention was paid to what features of this district, even though it's a very small area, are authentic representations of the community that lived there 80, 100, 120 years ago. And in the development of the design guidelines, careful attention was paid to how to encourage authentic expressions of that district's character without appropriation or without being disingenuous to what makes that district significant. But we'll talk more on September 14th about
So
those
I had
guidelines.
a question on the map on page 27, the height changes. So yeah, what is the philosophy behind going from 350 feet to 250 feet? I mean, those are both pretty tall. I assume those are both heights that are unfathomable to the Historic Landmarks Commission?
So that's a good question. The 250 feet is just outside of the historic district.
Right.
So those areas are not reviewed by the Historic Landmarks Commission. But where we're going to
So, I mean, yeah, what
125
if we kept it at 350 feet outside of the landmark area?
I might turn to Rachel to ask that piece about outside of the historic.
And I was also wondering about the 460-foot height limit change to 250, I guess. I'm just trying to, what's the guiding philosophy here? I mean, they're both pretty tall heights,
And
either or, 250 or 460. I'm somebody that likes tall buildings, so I want to err on the side of allowing taller buildings.
So that area outside of the historic district, part of the rationale for reducing the heights there is we've not seen in this area, there was a time where we thought that the kind of the commercial corridor coming from south downtown would kind of move up through that northern area north of Burnside and continue over into the Lloyd district. We didn't see that development pattern occur. And as development did occur in this area, what we've seen is that we have some smaller blocks that are remaining for redevelopment. And so the pattern of what's left are on smaller blocks. It doesn't mean that someone couldn't combine a larger number of parcels and redevelop, but the thinking was that these were more appropriate heights into the future for this area.
And one item to note, and why I passed the question on to Rachel, is the historic district and in the designation of the district casts a pretty tight boundary that is between Northwest 3rd and Northwest 5th, Burnside to Gleason. And so the Landmarks Commission purview is really just in that area. And so there's a little different philosophical approach for the areas outside of the historic district than the very targeted height recommendation in that area that's designated.
So, I mean, this is a 20-year plan. Do we not think that new development is ever going to punch through north of Burnside? I mean,
We
you said,
do-
you
yeah.
said it
I
hasn't
think one thing
happened to
that's-
date, but I guess
Right.
looking in the future, should we
Right.
disallow that opportunity to happen?
So that's a good question. I think that it was more trying to right-size the heights with the pattern that we've seen develop. We haven't seen, I think the corridor we thought that would develop in the 72 plan and 88 plan, that continuing that commercial core of kind of like the big pinks, we haven't seen that occur. So this seemed to be we were setting the heights at at what we do typically see happening, and that 250 range seemed to be accurate for this area moving forward.
And part of that, Commissioner Saltzman, is that there are areas that we are keeping the real tall buildings all downtown in the central city. So it's not that we're saying we can't have buildings that are 450 feet, in the central city. It's just not in that area. And again, it's a 20-year plan, and things changed after the development had really occurred. I think one thing we don't want is, one-off giant buildings in just like 2 or 3 parts of town with nothing else around it. And I think we've kind of learned that.
Okay,
One
thanks.
last comment I may make on the height reduction in the historic district is we do expect you to receive significant testimony on this proposal. In our thinking around our policy approach, the Historic Landmarks Commission had previously requested a lower height, something on the order of 75 feet. However, we did have testimony received requesting a taller height. And so what we think 125 does is it keeps open the opportunity to propose a taller building to the Historic Landmarks Commission and allows them to have that nuanced discussion about appropriateness at 125 feet. But what it would do is close the door on a proposal for a building that would be significantly taller than what the Landmarks Commission may be able to fathom as appropriate.
Okay, thanks.
So this is a point where we do have some time for additional questions before we move to the next topic related to this area that we've been discussing.
I think it looks like we chimed in as we
Yeah,
needed
I
to.
think I
okay,
asked my
that's
questions,
fine.
yeah.
Okay. I know you had asked Commissioner Fritz some questions earlier, so I hope we responded to those.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really, it's unfortunate my colleagues aren't here than Commissioner Saltzman, because this is a very helpful briefing, very clearly laid out, and I appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
Let me turn that back on. So we're going to talk about the Willamette River now. So I'm under the blue tab.
Just before we move on, the question you started with, Commissioner, about the bridgehead heights. So the way this will work is, as we go into the hearings, the mayor will have a set of amendments that we're going to be putting forward that are largely technical, but that would be the time where if any of the commissioners have amendments you want to get on the table, it's like we did with the comprehensive plan. It'd be great to get them on the table at that hearing, so all your hearings are with the public knowing that these other items are there for discussion, and it's up to the commission about, the city council about putting them on the table for discussion, and then ultimately we'll just vote on them.
Thank you.
Okay, so on to the Willamette River. I'm on page 34 now in your binder. So really the big move here on the Willamette River is that we are replacing the 1988 Greenway Plan for the central reach of the Willamette River with new zoning code, and that's in Volume 2A, Part 2, one of the various volumes that you're getting there. We have new zoning code coming forward. I want to say that this does not apply to South Waterfront. So even though South Waterfront is within the central city, it's governed by its own set of regulations related to the Willamette. It also does not apply to industrial properties in the central city. So it doesn't apply to Lower Albina. That we will address when we come back to addressing industrial properties with the North Reach.
You just said the North Reach, so that's coming separately from this entire package?
I'll let Sally.
Yes, this is just focused on the central city.
Yeah, right. And I'm just curious, is the North Reach going to rise again from the ashes?
Yes, at some point in the future, our next focus will be on the south reach of the Willamette.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to walk through some of the big moves. There are 5 big moves that we're making on the Willamette River. And the first is increasing the river setback width. Today, development that is not river dependent or river related needs to be set back 25 feet from the top of bank. And the recommendation is increase that to 50 feet from top of bank. This is needed because there needs to be enough room for public recreation and education and natural resources. And 50 feet is the absolute minimum that science recommends for natural resource protection. River-dependent uses and river-related uses include things like the Greenway Trail, viewing areas, docks. Those things are allowed within that setback space there. In fact, we want the Greenway Trail along the river in this area. An existing development that's there today that isn't river-dependent or river-related, it can stay. It's non-conforming, but it can stay. It cannot expand within the river setback, that use. And the setback will need to be landscaped. We've updated landscaping standards within there. There was general support at Planning and Sustainability Commission for this, but there is going to be some testimony about one topic I'll touch on in a minute related to marine passenger terminals. So the next page is applying a new river environmental overlay zone to the river, riverbanks, and land within 50 feet. So as you probably have heard before, the Willamette River is home to a number of species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and it's also on the Pacific Flyway, so we've got thousands of birds moving through our area. And applying this river environmental overlay zone brings the Willamette into the same level of protection that we afford to our other water bodies throughout the city, like the Columbia River, Johnson Creek, and other wetlands. This approach with this zoning code will have the typical two-track where there's standards and exemptions for things like utilities and the trail and other things that we expect, and then there'll be review for more impactful things like a dock would need to go through river review. Overall, though, we actually expect that there will be less development that will go through review because today everything goes through Greenway review. So putting standards and exemptions in will hopefully reduce that amount of review. Generally, there was support for this at Planning and Sustainability Commission. The next page is related to retail and open space. So today there's a provision in the central city where you can have retail in some open spaces, and this provision will bring that down to the river. So it's allowing some limited retail in Tomahawk Waterfront Park and East Bank Crescent near OMSI. We heard through planning process that a lot of park users would like to see additional uses like kayak rentals or ice cream carts within the parks. They would need to be set back 50 feet because they're not a river-dependent or river-related use. We heard testimony on both sides at Planning and Sustainability Commission about this, some concern about retail uses in parks, and then others in support of it. So we expect to hear more at City Council.
What was the testimony about the propriety of retail uses in parks, or was it about the 50-foot setback for those retail uses?
I would characterize it more as a disagreement about allowing retail within open space that should be dedicated to open space use.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Next page is river-related uses. So I alluded to this before with marine passenger terminals. Like I said, most development really needs to be set back from the river, but we do allow some uses in closer to the river, and we proposed a refinement to the definition of river-related as it relates to marine passenger terminals to allow a few more uses within the setback, and those uses would be passenger waiting and queuing areas and security checkpoints. We also included then a limitation on the size of that within the setback, so it's balancing with the other uses that we want to see in the setback. This did also receive testimony on both sides, and so you'll probably hear from both sides on this particular issue as well. And the last Willamette River topic that I wanted to bring forward to you is temporary floating structures. So this came forward a little bit late, near the end of our work sessions with Planning and Sustainability Commission. And what this is, as you've heard, swimming in the river is increasing in popularity. We're getting a lot more of that, and Planning and Sustainability Commission wanted to be supportive of that. So this standard would allow up to 8 small floating structures or swimming platforms in the river. We put in a number of provisions to reduce the impact on the habitat there, so they can only be in the river in the summer months. They need to be located 50 feet out, so they're not impacting shallow water habitat. So there's a few ways that we're trying to minimize that impact. But because it came in late, we expect there'll probably be testimony about it coming forward. So those are the big Willamette topics, and we'll pause there for discussion before we move on.
When it says only in open space for the temporary floating structures. I mean,
That's right.
Isn't the river all open space? Or-
It's not. So our zoning, the zoning on the land actually goes all the way to the center of the river. So if the zoning in a lot of it is the CX, as we were mentioning, I think Nicholas might pull a map up. So anywhere that you see the purple or the blue or the red that touches the river, that actually goes all the way into the center of the river. We just put the river on top. The green, however, is where the open space is, and it extends in. It's mostly parks. There is some OMSI property that is right there at the East Bank, yeah, that is also open space. A
Thanks.
little teeny bit down there at the bottom.
Keep going.
All right, let's keep going. So the next tab, the kind of turquoisey one, is green buildings. There are three big provisions that we're bringing forward related to green buildings that I'm going to talk about. And before I do that, though, I want to couch this discussion in the guiding principles and the goals and policies that we have in the comprehensive plan, the climate action plan, and the city's green building policy. So there's a lot of goals and policies that support all three of these provisions as a package. One of those in the climate action plan is a goal to reduce carbon emissions in the building sector by 33% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And another action in the plan is to decrease heat island effects through strategies such as green infrastructure and eco-roofs. So we have a lot of policy supporting this. On the next page, you'll see two of the provisions that I'm going to walk through. The first is low carbon buildings. Excuse me. This provision will apply to new buildings over 50,000 square feet. And this provision is important because energy use in commercial buildings accounts for about 25% of the carbon emissions. So this helps us, this low carbon building provision helps us work towards that goal of reducing carbon emissions. Since 2001, most new construction in the central city is using a green building certification such as LEED, and we want to keep that momentum moving forward. So this provision would require developers to register with one of 4 green building organizations. We can only require registration, not certification, because certification is above and beyond what the state building code allows for, so we can only take it as far as the registration right now. The second provision is related to bird-safe glazing on exterior windows. As I mentioned before, all of Portland's on the Pacific Flyway, and bird strikes is an issue that we need to address here in Portland. This provision would be required for new and remodeled buildings. The requirement would be to include windows with etching or UV coating on the first 60 feet or adjacent to things like eco-roofs and landscaped walls and so forth. This provision also responds directly to a City Council resolution from 2013 directing city bureaus to seek opportunities to incorporate bird-friendly building design into plans and projects going forward.
Why just the first 60 feet of a building?
Hold that for 1 second, and I'll probably pull somebody else who knows more technical things than me. Or-
I could just
Oh,
give
go
a
ahead.
quick
Yeah.
response. So that first 60 feet is where we primarily see the vegetation, so kind of the height of our trees. And then, as Mindy mentioned, it would also apply adjacent to like an eco-roof because of the reflection of the vegetation from the eco-roof or from trees within that first 60 feet.
Awesome. The last one is eco-roofs. So Rachel mentioned before that we've overhauled our bonus system. Eco-roofs was a bonus in that's now going away. It was actually a popular bonus that is now going away, and it's going to be replaced with a requirement for eco-roofs on new buildings over 20,000 square feet. 60% of the rooftop would need to be covered in eco-roof. That 60% of rooftop is after you take out mechanical, life safety, or solar. Then the rest, you look for the 60% on the rest of that for eco-roof.
So is there an option to have just the whole thing solar?
Yes. You could just do all solar and do no eco-roof.
Thank you.
Eco-roofs provide lots of benefits. This is why we looked at these overall. It's not just stormwater, it's also heat island effect, it's improving air quality, providing habitat for birds and pollinators, and improving livability overall. So they meet a lot of goals under the Climate Action Plan and Comprehensive Plan. all three of these combined received a lot of support at Planning and Sustainability Commission, but we also had a lot of discussion about cost. There were questions that the commissioners had about the cost of these, and so Prosper Portland and Bureau of Environmental Services did some additional work. And the bottom line of all of that is, if you did all three provisions, it would add about 1% of the total project cost into a project. So Planning Commission had this information, and they decided to go ahead and recommend all three provisions coming forward.
And my understanding is that the parking garages don't have to have this, or was there a discussion about parking garages?
That's right. So if the top floor, if your rooftop is actually used for parking, you don't have to put an eco-roof on it. You don't need to then put another cover over it to put an eco-roof.
Was there discussion at the Planning Commission about that?
Yes,
What was the rationale for saying no?
that's included. We included that amendment in there to not require eco-roofs over when the top floor is used for parking.
And is that mostly based on economics, that you then lose the parking?
I
Was
think
it about
that,
height or?
no, the discussion was mostly about that, the economics of having the parking garage and then having to add another level to then do an eco-roof. So we added the exemption for that top level if it was used for parking. So any area that's not used for parking, there are some parking structures today that are, the top level is only partial parking. We would need to then consider that other area and how much is left for an eco-roof.
Thank you.
I'll also point out with that all impervious surface has to be addressed from a stormwater management standpoint, so this doesn't get them out of other regulations that they have to meet.
Could you refresh my memory? What's the difference between registration versus certification with a third-party program?
Rachel, you want to answer that one? Okay.
So registration, it's a cost of anywhere from maybe $500 up to $2,500. So they're registering with a green building program. They're making decisions, working with that new company of what they'll pursue for their building to make it more energy efficient. Full certification means is they've gone the whole way and they are now certified. They have done everything on the checklist to meet, let's say, a LEED certification is one that we see quite often. So in this case, the registration, as Mindy said, that's what we're trying to require at this point through this proposal, because we can't go the full route of requiring certification because it's more stringent than the building code right now. But we want to maintain that momentum. We see so many buildings that are moving forward using some sort of a green building program, and we don't want to lose that momentum in the next 20 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions on that? Mauricio?
Good morning. Mauricio Leclerc with Portland Bureau of Transportation. I'm here to present the transportation element of the plan, and as is a tradition, we've been working very closely with Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to come up with a multimodal transportation package that addresses the needs of the plan, the objectives of the comprehensive plan, and enhances the livability of the central city and accommodates the growth that we've been talking about today. So tab 5 is where I have about 4 or 5 slides. And basically, I have 4 topics. One is what the main elements in the Central City Plan that will be amendments to the TSP, our transportation system plan. Those include policies, street classification maps, and a list of projects and studies. Then we'll talk about parking and all the work we did to simplify the parking code and introduce innovative ideas. Designate the Central City as a multimodal mixed-use area, which is a new ODOT designation, and I'll explain that in a little bit. And finally, talk about a project of regional significance. Out of the 119 TSP projects that we have at the Central City, this one is the one that generated the most discussion at City Council, at Planning and Sustainability Commission. And you're likely going to hear testimony on later this year. So on the first slide, TSP policies, we're updating the policies and targets. And again, we want to support non-auto use in good urban form. All the policies, the parking, the policies, the transportation studies have led to, setting a target of 80% non-auto commute mode by 2035. So by 2035, 80% or better or more people will commute to the central city by modes other than drive.
Does that include transit?
Yeah, that includes, people will be commuting primarily by transit, walking, cycling, carpooling as well. So, do we have a lot of projects in there? As I mentioned, 119. Most of them support are bike, transit, and pet related, about 2/3 of them. Very many of them are safety related. So you're going to see in volume 2B is where you have a list of projects, and also we have them online. There's the Portland Map app that you can actually tap, and on a certain line, and you get to learn about the definition of the project and the timeline and the cost. But basically, we have big projects, including the Green Loop, which will that relate to improvements in the Rose Quarter for transit, improvement on transit on the bridgeheads. Buses are getting stuck, and we were here a month ago, to discuss how to improve transit operations. Many new bicycle and pedestrian projects throughout the city, and freight-related improvements in the Central East Side. We have funding that we've identified to make improvements in the Central East Side for freight and for bicycles and make sure that they work and they well together over there. It's a regional flexible fund, $5 million grant project that we got. Also, we have $9 million to work on the Central City multimodal safety improvements, and that project is going to kick off this year, this fall, and it's going to implement many of the recommendations that you see in this plan. So moving on to parking, we have currently it's a good parking code, but it's very long, complex to navigate. So one of the things we did, we worked with the committee to find ways to simplify it and find ways in which we can improve it. And we believe we've done so. Basically what we have, we continue the no minimum parking requirement for the entire Central City, and where we did not have maximums, we have put maximums on all uses. And where we had maximums, we pretty much taken them down so that each building, each development cannot build as much parking as with the present code. Again, that supports our multiple goals and among other things. At the same time, we've allowed for more flexible use of the parking that you have, and the new parking. We call it shared parking. Basically, you could be able to rent it out commercially, so that at the end. The objective here would be to get better use of existing parking supply and eliminate the need to build so much new parking. Today, if each building has parking for me, I come in, I leave, and it's remain empty for most of the day. So why can't you tap into other people's parking when they're not being used? Create long-range arrangements between, for example, a restaurant and a bank, or a theater in which you don't have competing needs at the same time. And that will lead to less parking, potentially less driving, but also lower the cost of development, and potentially have equity implications on the Central City as a whole. Also, we have prohibitions on new surface parking in most areas. Today, it only applies to the core, basically the downtown area. Now, we're going to have a prohibition on new surface parking lot throughout the Central City, with the exception of if an industrial use needs to create parking in industrial areas, such as Central East Side and Lower Albina, and those will be limited to 20 stalls. And we've also simplified the mechanics of the plan. Many sectors, 24, and then core area versus non-core area. Now you'll be able to refer to where you are in the Central City, and the policies are a lot simplifier. We have 75 pages. Now we'll have about 10 pages, much easier to read and follow if you're a developer, and if you are also the general public trying to understand what a proposal can do. Now we have teams of lawyers throughout the Central City that their specialty is to try to interpret the code. So. Next slide is about the mixed-use, multimodal mixed-use area. This is a new designation that the state of Oregon developed a few years ago. It's trying to answer a problem that while the state of Oregon supports density and growth of the central cities and downtowns throughout the state of Oregon also has other goals, which is to maintain mobility of the freeways. Well, every time we were trying to do what we're doing today, which is, come up with a land use proposal that changes FAR and increases the development capacity of an area, ODOT was saying, wait a minute, you're adding trips to the freeway, and basically beginning to deny some of that, those land use changes. And we have examples in the central city that do that. Central East Side got at one proposal at Water, and Yamhill got a trip cap. So ODOT said, yes, you can build it, but no more than 100 trips per day, for example. South Waterfront, they begin to say, you cannot really go there because you're going to have an impact on our ramp. So we work with the state and come up with a process in which we're going to do some targeted improvements to the freeway and safety operations, and then they basically lift the congestion mobility standards that apply. It would not apply to the central city because it would be a multimodal mixed-use area. Safety standards will remain, and we're very we're very concerned ourselves about safety. So that will be the consideration to have a conversation about a land use change, not that we added 10, 20 trips to the network in 2035, which was the kind of conversation we were having previously. And finally, the Broadway Wilder project, it's not new to you because you were here when we adopted the Northeast Quadrant back in 2012. The project is pretty much unchanged from that time, and it's actually been adopted by the OTC, Oregon Transportation Commission, Metro via the RTP process, and it's also it was in the TSP that was recently the TSP project list that was recently adopted by this council in 2016. So the idea, while we were going through the process of, that we're in now, Commissioner Smith from the Planning and Sustainability Commission proposed an amendment to remove the project. And there was, a good discussion with the Planning and Sustainability Commission. And but basically they voted to keep the project. It was a narrow vote. And add some conditions, that I can refer to at the end. But basically, we wanted to provide you a summary because you're going to hear about it. Also, the Oregon legislature voted to fund the project, so that's generated more conversation about it. And also, it was referred as part of the bottleneck projects. But in a sense, this conversation has basically called the project to be primarily about the freeway, but the real project is so much more. It's a multimodal project. So basically what you have here, we work together with ODOT and the public, if you recall, to improve the safety and operations of the interchange, but also, which is, one of the worst bottlenecks in the city, and actually the nation. It's number 36 in terms of freight bottlenecks. But also to fix the local streets. As you know, we have 5 bridges that go over it. They're not seismically upgraded, and they have, they don't have very good facilities. So also we were trying to address the needs of the central city, including the Lloyd District, which is going to get about 8,000 new housing units and 9,000 new jobs. And as you can see in this picture, the freeway is a barrier, and it has been since it was built. And this project provides an effort to improve the mobility of, the regional mobility of the freeway, but also begin to address some of the barriers that the freeway created. So as a result of the project, there's, in terms of ODOT tells us that there's, after modeling, there's a 50% reduction in crashes expected as part of the project. That leads to less congestion. The main benefit is, this project is not the one that builds capacity, to the point in which we relieve congestion. What it does instead is to provide shoulders and an auxiliary lane that allow less crashing, less weaving and less conflicting moves that lead to crashes, and the crashes then lead to congestion. So we call that non-recurring congestion. And it happens quite a bit. As I mentioned, this is the top safety area for the state of Oregon. So the project will allow us to have shoulders and another lane, providing that room for people to maneuver and not be stuck on a lane that they don't want to be in. On the local side, and this is very exciting, it provides the ability to rebuild all the bridges, and we work very closely with the community to stay within the freeway right away and not to take any additional buildings and actually create a network of local streets that support the growth of the area, including potentially greater access to the Portland Public School site, which is a master plan site. So we will get improved bicycle and pedestrian facilities over the overpasses, seismic upgrades to all the bridges, additional bike and pedestrian routes, better facilities overall, state-of-the-art facilities, up to our new standards, better connectivity to development, better local connections throughout, alternatives to the heavy traffic with some pedestrian-only bridges to the south and a new connection to the north of Broadway and Wilder, as well as LITs. There could be targeted caps over the freeway that I think can provide some exciting non-transportation choices, such as potentially open space and actually reduce noise and emissions from the freeway itself. So that's the project in a nutshell, and you're likely going to hear testimony about that. So the commission voted to keep the project, but put some conditions that you'll find in volume 5, I believe, implementation. They're basically that we want all of the facility to be built, not just part of the freeway, and that we will work on an equity strategy as part of this larger project, that transparency be used for how the funds are allocated, and that we owe that and the city work on congestion pricing as a way to, as we look into this project. And actually part of the bill in Salem does address, does call out for looking into congestion pricing in the Portland region. So we feel that these are good recommendations, and they are now in the plan. So that's it. That's all I have. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Mauricio? No? Okay. All right, well, this is our last slide here, and again, these are the hearing dates, September 7th and 14th, and the various ordinances and resolutions that we'll be hearing on those particular days. And then we'll be scheduling some time to go through amendments. As I mentioned earlier, the mayor will be proposing some amendments, and we'll be getting those to you next week, I believe. And again, Commissioner, if you or other commissioners have amendments, if you could get those to us and we can compile them into one amendment package so that we can introduce those on September 7th or whichever appropriate date. And then the public can weigh in on that.
So Sally, are we going to put out the amendments before, for the public to see before the hearing?
Yes, yes.
And so can we send an email around to council to propose a date that we get your amendments by so that we can make sure that the public gets to see them before the hearing date, if possible? Obviously, you can still come in and put them in anytime.
I think the two of us, I know for sure, process things differently on these types of matters.
Okay,
My amendments are going to emanate from testimony.
okay,
I'm not going to be presenting amendments ahead of time.
okay.
But if I hear something that I think needs to be an amendment, I'll offer an amendment, but it's not going to be ahead of time.
Absolutely fine. I was just saying, if we have them ahead, it's great to put them out. Always, we have amendments on the floor as we move through the process. That's great. I'm also thinking that hopefully this was helpful for the two of you.
It's excellent.
That we should, much to all your chagrin maybe, have a makeup date for the other three. So we will probably try to do that. I think it's more helpful to be with at least one other person when you go through this than to have us, we could do this with each one of you.
Yeah.
But I think you learn from each other's, so.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's good to have those open public discussions, so thank you very much. I might even come again.
Okay.
Very, very well done. Thank you very much. A lot of thought went into preparing this and great delivery. So thank you. More to come.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
It's a good-looking plan, so I like it.
Thanks.
Enjoying your summer? Some, here and there.